delight to be here this evening. Connie and I, this year, are traveling the route of the Great March for Climate Action. So there's about 250 marchers that are going from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. over 8 months. Only about 50 of them are doing the whole 3,000-mile march. And we've got about 100 speaking engagements lined up along that route in churches and colleges and this sort of thing. And so we're sort of cheerleading and promoting it, although we ourselves are not marching a whole lot, a little bit. And we've been, as Jennifer mentioned, we've been living on the road now for 12 years. Connie and I just 2 weeks ago celebrated our 12th year anniversary of traveling North America, speaking in churches and colleges and universities, and literally from evangelicals to atheists and everything in between. Because what we focus on is the sacred side of science. We focus on what reality, and I'll be using the word God and reality interchangeably, and you'll see why I do that, and why I think it's not only legitimate to do that, but why it's also inspiring and empowering to do that. But we focus on what God has been revealing through evidence, through scientific, historic, and cross-cultural evidence over the last several hundred years, and how that can make sense of the challenges in our own lives. It can also help make sense of religious differences. And it can also give us some clarity in terms of how to move forward, how to move into a just, healthy, and sustainably life-giving future. And working together with people of different belief systems in that process. What we call reality, the ancients called God. See, language changes over time. Words create worlds. That is, the language that we use to think about reality actually structures and affects our experience of reality. I mean, the classic example that we've all heard is that if you have simply 2 names for snow, dry snow and wet snow, you have a less intimate, less personal, less rich experience of snow than, say, cultures that have a half a dozen or more different names for the different kinds of snow. Well, what we also, many of us aren't aware of, is that language that we use, and we all know what it means, wasn't even used in the distant past. For example, I'm going to name about 6 different words. None of these words existed for the Hebrews. None of these concepts existed for the Hebrews. In the same way that the word tree as an abstraction, like tree, the word tree to encompass lots of different kinds of trees, that didn't exist until we had writing. For most of human history, there was not the generalized abstract concept of tree. So the word life didn't exist for the Hebrews. The word wind and breath didn't exist for the Hebrews. In fact, the Hebrews' name, they personified, they had an I-thou personal relationship to what we call breath and what we call wind. They had the word ruach, ruach Adonai, ruach Elohim. The Spirit of God was their experience. You didn't need to believe in the Spirit of God. You don't need to believe to breathe. You don't believe in your breath. You don't believe in wind, especially here in New Mexico. You don't need to believe in the wind. The wind's real, right? The wind is undeniably real. Breath is undeniably real. And that's what they call, what we secularize and say wind and breath, they call ruach, the Spirit of God. What we call the environment, that word didn't exist for the Hebrews. Reality, the word reality didn't exist in any ancient culture. So we use word, now clearly what we mean by climate, what we mean by wind, what we mean by reality, what we mean by life existed for the Hebrews, right? But they had an I-thou relationship. They had a personal relationship with what we sort of take for granted in a depersonalized way. Martin Buber, the great Jewish theologian, wrote a book called I and Thou. And what he said was that if we treat any person or any aspect of nature as an an I-it relationship rather than an I-thou relationship, he said God is not present. The divine is not present when we use others, when we use nature for our benefit, but we don't respect it, but we don't honor it. And because the last 500 years we've been using as our framing metaphor for reality clocks. See, what happened was we invented clocks. We invented pendulum clocks. And once the pendulum clock was invented, we started using that as an analogy for what we today call nature. And once you think of nature as a clock, God becomes trivialized. The only way to think about the creator of a clock is outside the clock. See, prior to clocks as our basic metaphor for nature, God was understood as immanent and omnipresent. That is, there was no place that God stopped and something else started. God was revealed in every drop of experience, through the eyes of every creature. In every aspect of reality, you found the divine. You could not look at any aspect of what was inescapably real and not see God. God was transcendent, but God was also immanent and omnipresent. But once we started thinking of nature as a complex clock, you can no longer experience the immanence and omnipresence of the divine. Impossible. You can talk about it, you can't experience it. So God became the clockmaker outside a clockwork universe. So then God no longer is a synonym for reality, for what's inescapably, undeniably real. God is now an idea. You can either believe in the clockmaker or disbelieve in the clockmaker. So not only does nature become desacralized, we can do anything we want with nature. We can dig it up, plow it up, blow it up, whatever. It's not the body of God. It's not the goddess. It's not Gaia. It's not, any of these ancient ways of personifying reality. It was just nature. It's just nature. And God becomes trivialized. No longer is God inescapably real. God is now an idea outside the universe that you can either believe it or not. And prayer becomes petitioning a divine being to miraculously intervene according to however you're praying. Rather than what we've now discovered is, nesting dolls. Have you ever seen Russian nesting dolls? Like dolls within dolls within dolls? One of the fundamental truths that we now know through evidence, through science, is the nested creative nature of reality. Subatomic particles are within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, within galaxies. At all nested levels, like nesting dolls, every level can create. Every level can bring something new into existence that didn't exist before. Molecules are created. Hydrogen, oxygen come together, water created. Water's created. But stars are created. We now know how reality made the periodic table of elements. We now know how the atoms of our bodies were made. In fact, if any of you have been watching the Neil deGrasse Tyson redo of Carl Sagan's Cosmos, he's fond of saying that we are stardust. When I speak in theological context, I say, we now know how God made the atoms of our bodies inside stars. We don't need to believe that anymore. God has revealed it through knowledge. And again, I'm using the word God as a synonym for reality. In fact, let me stop and say something that's important here. I mentioned that what we call God, or what we call reality, the ancients called God. If you were in a polytheistic culture, however, they were the gods. See, that's the genius of monotheism, is they start saying that there's not the God of the ocean and the God of this and the God of that and the God of that. There's one God, there's one reality. But here's the thing. All God, this is the fundamental, most important scientific discovery, I would say, in the last 100 years about religion, is that all gods and goddesses, with no exception, can be understood in either an undeniable way or an unnatural way. Either in a factual way, factual, undeniable, or fictional, unnatural. Let me give you a couple examples. If you understand Uncle Sam as a literal Uncle Sam, that's fictional. If you understand Uncle Sam as a personification of what we call the U.S. government, that's factual. It doesn't matter whether you believe in Uncle Sam or not. The government's real, right? You may not like it, you may like it, whatever, but it's real. Poseidon. See, fictional creatures, fictional beings, fictional entities can only be experienced in the literature and in your subjective experience. Harry Potter, for example, is a fictional character. I can read about Harry Potter, I can close my eyes, I can have an imaginary, deeply meaningful conversation with Harry Potter in my imagination, but I can't experience Harry Potter with my senses. I can't experience Harry Potter in the real world, as they say. So, a fictional understanding of Poseidon. I'm just going to pick a few gods from this text. Poseidon, if you understand Poseidon as the god of the oceans, or the spirit of the oceans, that's fictional. It's unnatural. If you understand Poseidon as a personification, that is giving human characteristics to this incomprehensibly powerful and capricious seas, That's factual. That's undeniable. It doesn't matter whether you believe in Poseidon or not. When you're near the ocean is undeniably, inescapably real. Soul, or Helios for Greeks. Helios was not the god of the sun or the spirit of the sun. Helios was a personification of what we today call, in a depersonalized way, the sun. Gaia was not the goddess of the earth or the spirit of the earth. Gaia was a personification of what we call earth. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you believe in Gaia or not. This is real, you know. Pick any. And notice the difference. If you think about God, for example, the Almighty, as a supernatural person outside the universe who has the characteristics all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful, the great conundrum has been, how can you square an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God with the existence of evil? This is the classic problem of evil. That evaporates when you get personification, when you get that all concepts of the divine are personifications. God is a personification of love. God is a personification of power. God is a personification of knowledge. Then becomes undeniable. Power exists, love exists, life exists. The same thing with Satan. If you think of Satan as a disembodied entity, some spirit floating around somewhere, that's a fictional understanding of Satan. If you understand Satan as a personification that's giving human characteristics to everything inside of us and outside of us that would diminish or destroy the quality of our life and relationships or diminish our legacy, that's undeniably real. There are powers, there are forces within us. In fact, the last TED Talk that I did was all about that. If y'all are interested, I can go into some of that. But it was basically called Why We Struggle and Suffer. The reason we struggle and suffer, the reason we get addicted, our kids or our grandkids get addicted, the reason we shoot ourselves in the foot, the reason we so easily overeat, or we, waste too much time watching TV, or all the different things that we do, has got nothing to do with our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother eating an apple. That's a mythic story that points to profound truth. But if we take it literally, we trivialize what God has been revealing now, what reality has been revealing through all forms of evidence. We now know that the reason we struggle and are tempted and all that is because we have mismatched instincts. That is, our deepest, most compelling drives that are just as compelling as any animal's instincts are mismatched for today's conditions. So our instincts evolved to serve the survival and reproduction needs of our ancestors prior to the agricultural revolution. But every year for the last 10,000 years, our instincts have been more and more mismatched. So that now, whereas all other animals, their instincts serve them. They help them survive and reproduce. Our instincts, because we're living in a world that's so different than prior to the agricultural revolution, our instincts half the time sabotage us, or make our lives difficult, or tempt us to go out of integrity, or whatever. So Satan understood as a personification of these inner forces and the outer. A dear friend and colleague of mine, he died just a few years ago. He's one of the most famous liberal Christian theologians, Walter Wink. He talked about the powers that be were personifications of what we today would call institutional evil or systemic evil. See, systemic evil is when you've got a structure, your society or your government or your economic system is structured that makes good people do bad things. It causes good moral people to just naturally do things that aren't healthy for themselves or their world or their future. That's systemic evil. Like, for example, right now we've got a governmental and economic system where it's possible and it's profitable for a subset of the whole. Remember thick nesting dolls. For a subset of the whole to benefit at the expense of the whole. It's possible and it's profitable for an individual or corporation to get wealthy at the expense of the community or the bioregion of the planet itself. In other words, we currently allow for the free or subsidized polluting of the commons. That's collective insanity, folks. That's not sustainable. We can't continue to allow the free or subsidized polluting of the air, water, soil, and life upon which we all depend. That's a systemic injustice. It's a systemic design flaw. You see, we're young. We're not evil. Most of us. I mean, there are 2% of the human species are born without the mental capacity to feel empathy and compassion. So there are sociopaths, there are psychopaths. So I don't want to deny that. But 98% of us, we have compassion and empathy. But we're in a system that makes it so that the cheaper, easier, more convenient thing to do is usually the wrong thing to do. We have to redesign the system so that the cheaper, easier, more convenient thing to do is the right thing to do. That's what the kingdom of God is all about. It's not some pie-in-the-sky thing. It's about restructuring our way of doing things so that it serves reality, it serves life. So again, my first point is that what we call reality, the ancients called God. And any understanding of God that is not at least a synonym for reality is trivial, impotent, and deserves to be rejected as the new atheists do. The God that Richard Dawkins claims is a delusion, in his book, The God Delusion, is a delusion. He's talking about a fictional God. He's not talking about a factual God, the God that's undeniable. He's talking about some supernatural being up there, out there, who blesses some and smites others. Who's for this football team, but not that football team. So what we call reality, the ancients called God. How has God been communicating to humanity? How has reality been revealing itself, to use its secular language, over the course of human history? How does reality reveal itself to all animals or all plants? There are two things that every culture has needed to address. Two questions, fundamental questions that every society, every culture in human history has needed to address. One is, what's real? The nature of reality. And the other is, what's important? Sort of the values. So facts and values. So what's real, or how things are, and what's important, or which things matter, are things that all cultures need to address. And when I say living in right relationship to reality, if what we call reality the ancients called God, then living in right relationship to reality is what the ancients might have called dwelling in the kingdom of God. It's living in right relationship to reality. In fact, that's the single most important thing that we need to do as individuals. Our lives suffer when we are out of right relationship to reality. When we're full of deception, arrogance, bitterness, judgment, hatred, we're out of right relationship to reality. When we're lying, this is when we're serving our own self-centered needs and, to hell with others, this is out of right relationship to reality. And we struggle, we suffer. And so, how has God been revealing? Well, for most of human history, before we had writing, I call it Religion 1.0. Religion 1.0 is the authority of elders. Like, where is your primary source of authority regarding what's real and what's important, or how things are, and which things matter? Well, it was the elders, the tribal elders. So they were the means of discerning God's will. They were discerning the way reality really is and how to live in right relationship to reality. And of course, if you were living in a desert or the tundra or this part of the world, reality shows up differently in different parts of the world and different times in human history. And yet we all need to live in right relationship to reality. If we don't, we suffer, and our societies suffer. In fact, one of my favorite quotes, this Loyal Rue is a philosopher of religion. He's one of I consider him the single most significant philosopher of religion alive today. And he's written a number of books. One of them, he says, he calls Amythia. Remember that Martin Buber quote I was talking about in the necessity of having an I-thou personal relationship to reality, and if we don't, we suffer and our world suffers? Well, he wrote a book called Amythia. He says the reason one of the major problems in Western society is that we no longer have a personal relationship to reality. We think we have a personal relationship to God, but many of us imagine God only in otherworldly ways. So we can have a personal relationship to God in our imagination, but if we don't have a personal relationship to the people in our lives, and that is an honorable, respectful relationship, if we don't have a personal relationship that is an honorable, respectful relationship with nature, and if we don't have a personal, honorable relationship to the past and the future, that is honoring the past and being a blessing to the future, being of service to the future, being Christian, being a little Christ, that's what the term originally meant, being a little Christ. That is being a blessing to the future. If we don't do that, then that's the problem that we're in. So that was his book, Amythia. Well, he also wrote a book called Religion is Not About God. What he means is that religion is about a relationship to reality. And yes, reality has been personified as the various gods and goddesses, But what we're talking about, what religion is all about, is helping people live in right relationship to what's fundamentally, undeniably, inescapably real. So here's his quote. He says, the most profound insight in the history of humanity is that we should seek to live in accord with reality. Indeed, living in harmony with reality, maybe except there's a formal definition of wisdom. If we live at odds with reality, foolishly, then we will be doomed. But if we live in right relationship with reality, wisely, then we will be saved. And he goes on to say that every culture throughout all of history has had at least a tacit understanding of this fundamental principle. What we're less in agreement about is how we should think about reality, and what we should do, the practices that we should use to put ourselves into right relationship to reality. But that makes total sense when you realize that if you lived 100,000 years ago in Central Africa, or you lived 50 years ago in Europe, or you lived 5 years ago in China, Beijing, reality is different. It's like the 5 blind men and the elephant, or the 5 blind women and the elephant. If you've got 5 blind people, each experiencing a different aspect of reality, a different aspect of the elephant, if those were 5 different theologians, you'd have 5 totally different theologies. And believe it or not, religious differences are not a lot more complex than that. I mean, if you live, let's say this part of the world had never experienced sheep, the Lamb of God would not be a part of your tradition. If you over here had never experienced the political reality of a king, the kingdom of God would be an utterly foreign concept. You know, you can tell stories of lotus blossoms or whatever is a part of your experience. So we rarely step back and think about what's the purpose of religion. Like, that is, what is the evolutionary purpose? One of the things Connie and I preach and teach a lot about is the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious significance of science. Let me say that a little slower, because it's a little weird. I get that. The evolutionary significance of religion. That is, you have to step back and say, not just what do you understand as the purpose of your religion, but when you step back and say, what is the function, what is the evolutionary role of religion in the human animal? Like, what has religion helped us do that we couldn't have done without religion? Well, one of the things is that we cooperated at a larger scale. See, we will naturally cooperate and be kind and loving towards the people we're related to, blood related to. And also the people for whom we can have a sort of I scratch your back, you scratch my back, sort of what's called reciprocal altruism. That is, if I'm nice to you, you'll be nice to me. That we naturally do. So we'll naturally cooperate at the scale of about 200 people. We find that around the world. But to get 5,000 people cooperating, it takes religion. Throughout all of human history, until very recently, there's some secular ways now, but for all of human history, the way, whenever you found, in fact, Jonathan Haidt, he wrote a New York Times best-selling book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Differ on Politics and Religion. And chapters 9 through 11 are the best articulation of the evolutionary significance of religion in print. I think it's still a New York Times best-selling book. And he talks about, if you find 5,000 insects cooperating, you can be sure that they are genetically related. He said, throughout human history, when you found 5,000 human beings cooperating, you can be sure religion is there. Religions have fostered personal wholeness, that is, the individual, and social coherence. All religions provide a map of what's real and what's important that provide personal wholeness and social coherence. And all religions, with no exception, provide consistent access to the feeling states that we've always needed to thrive. Human beings simply cannot thrive. It doesn't matter what your religion, what your philosophy, where you've lived, it doesn't matter. You can't thrive as a human being if all you can do is look to the future with fear. We can only thrive as human beings if we can look to the future with trust, including trusting that we're not going to be here forever, we're going to die. All religions get people to the place of trusting death. They do it by different beliefs, but they all get them there to trust. The same thing. We can't thrive as human beings if all we can do is look to the past with resentment or guilt or bitterness. We can only thrive as a human being if we can look to the past with gratitude. In fact, that's part of what therapy is about, is helping people reinterpret their past to find something to be grateful for before all they had was resentment or guilt or bitterness. And then finally, we can't thrive as human beings if we're overwhelmed by the challenges of the day. We can only thrive when we're inspired to be in action, whatever the challenges are. Because as we all know, compost happens. Life just throws us a pile of junk to deal with. So how do we stay inspired to be in action, whatever the challenges are? Well, all religions get people to trust, gratitude, and inspiration. And they do so via different belief systems. We didn't have knowledge that could get us there until very recently. We now have knowledge that can unite all of us, but not in a way that disses religion, but in a way that helps religions themselves to evolve. See, we need science and religion to work together if we are going to avoid extinction.